Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for February 10th, 2023. It's Friday, so I'll be taking your questions. Again, I got many questions, and I'll get to at least 3 or 4 of them today. Uh, Keep sending me your thoughts, your questions. I'm open to being engaged in dialogue with as many of you as possible. Post your comments on Facebook or YouTube. Let's really have an ongoing deliberative process because there's so much at stake now, and we have to shake the populations of the Western world out of their dreams and their fantasies and their delusions because we're in an extremely dangerous moment, but one with incredibly great potential. Let's not let it pass us by. So let me start with the first question, and this is almost a Monty Python routine, this whole question of the China spy balloon. And some of you wrote, why would China use a spy balloon, or a balloon rather, to spy on the US when it has so many satellites in space? Well, it's an obvious question. And the answer from some of the neocons is, well, of course, the Chinese want you to think that so they could then use the spy balloon. Well, the first response from the military was there's no threat to the United States or to the American people from this balloon. Why put a balloon that's visible to the naked eye to use for spying? Now, and then why say this is a danger to our sovereignty? We have spy systems set up surrounding China. We have satellites, they have satellites, everyone's spying on everyone. The question is, why can't people sit down and talk? Remember, this spy balloon incident was used as an excuse to cancel a trip by Secretary of State Blinken to Beijing, where he would have met with top officials, including possibly Xi Jinping. So now that's scuttled. So what was the whole point of this? Well, it fits the needs of the military-industrial complex. You must always have an enemy in focus. The enemy at the moment continues to be Russia and Putin, with the line that Putin is a threat to the West. If you don't stop him in Ukraine, next thing you know, he'll be in the Champs-Élysées in Paris and so on. The reality is that the drumming up of an enemy image, what the Germans call a Feindbild, is a classic precondition for massive spending and war. And part of the war effort requires economic hardships for the population, the so-called war economy, which we see now in Europe, where the price of gas just jumped up another 10% yesterday, where people are having trouble in all the countries of Europe making ends meet, except, of course, for the most wealthy, who are gathering around with caviar and champagne to toast the heroic efforts of the comic strip hero Zelensky. So the needs of the military-industrial complex, more war. They've been building for this narrative on China with people like General Minahan saying, we're going to be at war by 2025, with Admiral Stanley Richards saying, we don't have enough capability in the Indo-Pacific region. We need more weapons, new ships, new kinds of nuclear capabilities, and on and on and on. The reality is that we're either going to end up in a nuclear war which will destroy the human race, or we're going to sit down and talk and we're going to reach agreements. Now, at this point, it would be to the great benefit of the United States to be working with Russia and China to set up a new financial system that's not based on the petrodollar or the City of London funny money schemes, including derivatives and swaps and so on. So that's the reality of the situation. Instead, they want you obsessing over whether the Chinese are looking down on you from a spy balloon to see what you're doing. You want to worry about spying? What about the NSA? What about the mass surveillance going on in the United States since 9/11 under the Patriot Act? So, Americans need to grow up a little bit and realize that the reality is that we're living under a regime which is committed to complete control over your mind. And the best way to break it is to recognize that these threats of so-called enemies, are not really threats at all, that other countries may have slightly different views of things or different intentions, but there's a capability to work these things out. That's what diplomacy is. That's what statecraft is. And we've lost that with the drive toward war. So, I wouldn't be so worried about the China spy balloon. I'd be a little bit more worried about what Google and Facebook and others and Instagram are passing around about your private interests. Now, the second question, why will the US and NATO not drop the Syria sanctions against Syria in a moment of such profound suffering as that caused by these earthquakes? Well, I think it's time for us to stop asking such questions. We know why. The people who control the policy in the United States don't give a damn about children dying. I know Blinken said at one point, when he thinks about the children of Afghanistan, he looks into the eyes of his children and sees them and he feels compassion for them. That's a lie. If he feels compassion for children, drop the sanctions. Stop killing Afghani children and Yemeni children and Syrian children. The sanction policy is one designed to punish the people of the nation, to force them to carry out a regime change, which the US couldn't do using ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Remember, what's the narrative about Syria that is the one that's driving the continuation of the sanctions? It's that Assad is a brutal dictator, that he gassed his own people, that we have to support democracy. Well, look, these are just lies. Assad won the last election with a very large vote. The people of Syria are, for the most part, supporting him. The ones who aren't have been fed Western propaganda, especially British, groups like the White Helmets and others, who are in there to try and stir things up. Why? Because this is the old British territory, the Middle East, as they call it. The idea that they can use ethnic divisions, use religious divisions to keep the flow uninterrupted of raw materials to the City of London and Wall Street. The idea that Assad gassed his own people has been exposed by Max Blumenthal and others, the Gray Zone, as a complete fraud. That the people who promoted this story are heavily funded by the British government, and they are involved in British propaganda of lying for the sake of continuing the involvement of hybrid warfare and other forms of warfare to keep nations divided and to extract their raw materials as cheaply as possible. Now, what does this have to do with killing Syrian children? Well, there's no reason to continue sanctions on a country that suffered so much because of the failure of U.S. policy. The U.S. policy was regime change. That was Obama's policy. It was somewhat pulled back by Trump, not fully, because Trump did accept the idea of gassing, that Assad's gassing his own people, when the evidence shows it's simply not true. But that's still the coverage in the media, that Assad is a brutal killer who kills his own people. In fact, the Syrian people have a long history, a long tradition of independence and defense of sovereignty. And who stood up for Syria? It was Russia. The Russians came in and helped them fight back the terrorists. The Iranians helped them fight back the terrorists, while the U.S. provided weapons and training to Al-Qaeda. John McCain and Lindsey Graham were over there rubbing shoulders with Al-Qaeda terrorists. So the problem is the United States. Maybe we should have sanctions on members of the U.S. Senate who continue to push these war propaganda policies because they want the receipts from the military-industrial complex and a place to retire when they're done, like Lloyd Austin, the now defense secretary, after he left the Army, went to Raytheon. So we should stop asking these questions and fight against the people who use these narratives to act against our own national interests. The next question is a fairly simple one. What do you make of Zelensky's whirlwind tour of NATO capitals, in particular the London trip? Well, who did he see in London? King Charles, his asshole buddy, as they say, Boris Johnson. And I use that term figuratively and literally. Uh, Sunak, the parliament. What's the British interest in Ukraine? To destroy Russia, as they admit. The idea of providing long range precision missiles, tanks, aircraft is designed to extend the war and inflict more pain on Russia. Why? Because they don't like what Russia's doing in terms of moving to create an alternative to a collapsing Western financial and imperial system. Now, the real issue here is the fear in some circles, the pro war circles, that a Ukraine fatigue is setting in. We've now been at war for almost a year. The US has provided over $112 billion worth of weapons and financial aid, Europe about 67 billion euros. And here's Zelensky saying it's not enough, we need more. We're fighting for your European way of life. Well, does that European way of life include racist slaughter of people in the eastern Ukraine? Does that European way of life include shutting down media? Well, it might now because that's what's being done. Does it include shutting down alternative parties? This has nothing to do with defending Ukrainian democracy. It has to do with targeting Russia and targeting China. And so Zelensky goes to London, to Paris, and Brussels, and he's talking about winning the war. Well, what's it going to take to win this war? I don't think this war is winnable for Ukraine. I think the smartest thing the Ukrainians should do is sit down with the Russians now and work out an agreement for mutual security. Legitimate concerns that Russia has and legitimate concerns that Ukraine has. That's not what Zelensky intends. Zelensky intends to go back to the pre-war status quo, which means the oppression of the Russian population, Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. And don't forget, the people who were being killed in the Donbass from 2014 to 2022, they were Ukrainians. It was a civil war run by those people who were put in power by the US-sponsored Maidan coup. So Zelensky's trip to Europe is all theater. It's about show me the money, give us the money. And now the line from Ukraine, as I heard from a member of the World Ukrainian Council last night, what he said is that Ukraine should be a model for fighting corruption for the rest of the world. No, in fact, if it were a model, why did you wait from 2014 to 2023 to start arresting some of the people who are involved in corruption? And even more importantly, why are the people who are being shuttled around from different cabinet posts showing up in other posts? What about putting them in jail? The corruption in Ukraine is notorious. And I don't blame the Ukrainian people. I blame the oligarchy that came to power after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then after the Maidan coup, that a different group of oligarchs, some of them are still the same, took power and are exploiting Ukraine's mineral wealth and raw materials and good soil for their own benefit, working in partnership with BlackRock, Vanguard, and others to continue to loot the people of Ukraine. So the people of Ukraine gain nothing from Zelensky being the hero for the Western elites and the subject of much praise. What would really benefit them would be an end to the war. And there's a possibility for negotiations. The Pope has offered the Vatican as a setting, a venue for discussion with no preconditions. President Lula of Brazil has made a similar offer. Let's get this war over through real diplomatic negotiations and then get about the process of building a financial system that puts people first rather than private special interests like Vanguard, Bill Gates, and others. Finally, I have a question from our friend Mani from the United Kingdom, who I believe is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, on the Global South. He said the welcome to Lavrov in his recent trip to Africa should tell the West something. but there's US, European Union pressure on African countries to turn against Russia and China. So what can we say about that? Well, he's absolutely right. Much of the so-called global South is under enormous pressure now from their bankers, from the raw material cartels, to continue the new form of imperialism, which is essentially to allow the banks and the international corporate cartels to make the policy. That's not different at all from imperialism. The idea of the green agenda for Africa is a new form of exploitation of cheap labor to keep Africans poor, but working on behalf of the global corporate interests that have boards of directors in New York City, on Wall Street, at the City of London, and in Brussels. That's not a solution. And so leaders in Africa, leaders in South America, typified by Lula, by López Obrador of Mexico, countries of Asia are looking for an alternative. And that alternative is a new financial system which replaces the primacy of the dollar with the capability to trade and invest in regional and national currencies. This is a move that's well underway, which is in direct opposition to the Great Reset of Klaus Schwab and the Western bankers. And that's what we're seeing. That's what's being denounced by people like Joseph Borrell from the European Commission, who says that Europe is a paradise being invaded by a jungle from the rest of the world. Well, that reflects his and his colleagues' fear that their special perches, where they're allowed to sip champagne, eat caviar, and make pronouncements on the evil of governments that are trying to act as sovereign nations, that's threatened by the rise of the global South. In a sense, the emergence, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been talking, of a new non-aligned movement. That's the future of humanity. We in the West can scoff at it, we can make fun of it, we can do whatever we want. That's not going to stop the West from collapsing. Instead of having this superior eugenicist outlook toward the rest of the world, we should start cultivating cooperative, mutually beneficial relations. And that's what the Schiller Institute has been calling for in our insistence that there be a new strategic and economic development architecture to replace the world of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and NATO, and global NATO. So thanks for your questions. Keep watching our videos and circulating them and sharing them. We need a movement in this world for development of peaceful, mutually beneficial relations among sovereign nation states. It's coming. The only thing that will stop it is the insanity of the beasts who run the current world order and are committed to stop it, to protect their own special privilege. We can't let that happen. So join with us, and I'll see you again next week.